Budget 2025 will be delivered by Prime Minister and Finance Minister Lawrence Wong on February 18th. For many of us, the annual budget announcement is a highly anticipated economic event in Singapore's national calendar. But how does our national budget come to be? Have you ever wondered what the BTS, or behind the scenes of developing our next budget, looks like? And if you are Kipo like me, then you might also want to know if there is some kind of budget report card amongst countries. And if there is one, how does Singapore rank? Welcome to Lens on Singapore. I'm Claressa Monteiro. Joining me in the studio today are Andrew Blazey, Deputy Head of Budgeting and Public Management, Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, and Terence Ho, Associate Professor Practice, Singapore University of Social Sciences. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me in this conversation. OECD recently released a report on budgeting in Singapore. In reading the report, a key overarching theme that emerged for me is fiscal sustainability. How are we achieving this? I have so many questions, gentlemen. So we'll start with Andrew. Andrew, perhaps before we take a deep dive into the OECD report, you could give us an overview of the report, maybe a little bit of background on how the report is put together, who benefits from it, that sort of thing.
Great question to start with, and look, it's a pleasure and privilege to be here today, so thanks very much for making the time and having me here. This is a report which we've put together, and to your point about behind the scenes, it's very much that, because it looks at how the government budgets. It's not looking at what it's budgeted in terms of specific amounts, but really how is that process put together to support a quality process and quality decision making, and in doing so recognises that the government's undertaken many changes to its budget process and budget framework over the last few years, and this really takes stock and puts it together in one place. Okay,
this budget report card, shall we call it, for the benefit of this interview, how many budgets did you look at?
The last time we did one of these was 2006. So did we look at all of them between then and now? No. But what we did look at was where there were key reforms in the way the budget was put together. So, for example, changes to the net investment return framework, or ways in which the CPF has changed. They were things that have the introduction of Singa in terms of major infrastructure spending. These are things that have changed the way in which decisions are being made as they contribute to the construction of the budget. That's what we've looked at.
Okay. Now, then, my next question comes in two parts. The first part is for Terence. Could you give us an understanding of what fiscal policy is about and why it matters?
Yeah, great question again, and thank you for having me on this show.
Always
I think fiscal policy is really about the government's spending and how it finances that spending. And therefore, it's at the heart of any government's agenda in terms of delivering what the government promises to the people and how they're going to marshal the resources. And it affects all kinds of things, from economic development trajectory to the distribution of incomes among different segments of society, as well as between generations, spending today versus spending tomorrow. And of course, fiscal policy, because of government spending and revenue collection, affects macroeconomic stability. So it really covers all aspects of government's program in terms of delivering what it has promised to the people.
All right, and from there, following on, Andrew, what are some of the major discussions around fiscal policy globally right now? And how does this OECD report come into the picture within all of that?
This budgeting and fiscal policy is constantly a major conversation. And globally, that's because budgeting is very much a political event as much as it is an administrative one for the allocation of spending across government ministries for policy outcomes. And one thing that makes that so topical is that it indicates how the government is prioritising, what it's putting money to in order to achieve its policy goals. And at a time when there are more spending requests than probably any other in terms of the demands that countries face for where to budget, this is timely to say, how do those processes stand up here in Singapore?
But they change every year, right? The hot button issues change every year for an economy.
They do, and yet there are some standard ones in there that you're always going to see money going to health. You're always going to face pressures, I think, with an ageing population to see money going into care. But the key issue is, how's that done? How is that surfacing across a budget process? How is that being coordinated across government to ensure that there is effective delivery on the policy priorities that the government has?
If I may just pick up on that, I think that in each budget we always need to balance between spending for the long term, investment, infrastructure,
the fiscal
people,
sustainability,
as well as addressing the more sort of immediate priorities, and how we find that balance is always key.
All right, now we are having this conversation today because Singapore's budget announcement is coming up. If we view the OECD report as a report card, how does Singapore's budgeting measure up against its KPIs of fiscal sustainability? And Terence, I want to get your local perspective, your academic perspective first before we move on to Andrew's.
Yeah, so I think Singapore budgeting system, fiscal system, has some unique features. I think in terms of the constitutional safeguards regarding the having a balanced budget over a term of government, these are among probably one of the most stringent worldwide. So I think there's quite a few unique features that are meant to make sure that the system is sustainable in terms of being able to meet future spending needs, which are ramping up just like in any other country.
Okay, now, Andrew, from the perspective of OECD, and Terence actually already brought it up, what's unique about our budget and some of the things that are unique. What did you see from, doing this report? How does Singapore compare to other economies? What are those unique factors features in our budget? Where do we do well, being the Singaporean mother that I am? And where could we do better? What could we learn from other economies?
I think it's very much as Terence has said, that areas where this report and where practice shows that Singapore is strong is in its area of fiscal objectives, how these are expressed in terms of a balanced budget over the term of the government, how there are protections on past reserves, and how there is a very sophisticated governance arrangement around those with the two-key system. These are not only stringent, as you say, but these are well established, they're stable, they are written in the Constitution in terms of having the credentials that make them very strong, and they stand out for that, and they also show how they have been observed over time, how that budget balanced budget rule has been in place, has been adhered to, and so there's a lot of credibility that goes with that, and this is a document that helps put that together in one place that shows how that lines up.
Okay, I want to come back to one of the first questions I asked. So who does this report really benefit? Who's it really for?
It's for a variety of audiences. So it's for people who work in budgeting. It's for people who work in government in terms of understanding how the budget is put together, in terms of where their part may fit in. But it's also a statement, I think, that supports transparency in the budget process by actually articulating what it is. We can talk in general terms such as budget governance, and then you say, what is it specifically? Well, this is a way of putting that together. In the OECD, we have a group called Senior Budget Officials, and this group recognised that budgeting has many parts to it, whether it be fiscal rules, whether it be limits, so that there's fiscal discipline, and recognises that these come together and they form the way in which a budget is planned, is prepared, is approved by Parliament, is then implemented, but also the fact that this is an annual process and you're going to repeat it again next year. And so you want to build upon it, and you also want to know what took place so that that's possible. It's people who are involved in that cycle find a document like this useful.
If I may just add on as well, I teach in the public policy school, and from time to time I have other faculty and students who study public finance and budgeting who ask me, where can I find an authoritative write-up?
And you're saying this is it?
Yes, and I always refer them to the 2006 report, which Andrew mentioned earlier, that being the last OECD, or in fact any international report, documenting the system. And given the number of recent changes and enhancements to the budgeting system, this is very timely and appreciated.
Okay, so policymakers is what you're saying.
Academics.
How about the businessmen? Would this be a valuable piece of information for them, you know, to make business decisions, to drive our business narrative in Singapore?
I think to the extent that all businesses and households, they are affected by the budget, I think some understanding of how the system works is beneficial to the general layperson as well and members of the public.
Okay, Andrew, you touched on this already. What about transparency and oversight? Key takeaways from the Singapore case study as compared to other economies ensuring good governance?
One of the things that stands out from undertaking the work with the Ministry of Finance is how much energy and investment it puts into communicating the budget and what's in it. And really being purposeful about what that is, which audiences need to be aware or be informed of what's in it each year, how it impacts on them, how do they access it, and from that aspect, the way in which the ministry looks online, uses social media, looks at business audiences, actually thinks about its communication strategy and what needs to go out in the budget. This stands out very strongly for Singapore. There are also very detailed documents around the proposals that make up the composition of the budget, if you want to drill down into that detail. For a lot of people, they don't. They want the headline message. They want to know that those important fiscal rules about a balanced budget have been observed, that their views of fiscal discipline and that the government is staying within its means, they're important headline messages for it. But then there's also what's in it for me? The ministry, along with the line ministries with their own proposals in terms of the detail, are very good at getting that out. And that's been a best practice that we've used in terms of looking at Singapore in some of our work.
That transparency, Terence, that yes. Andrew's referring to, how important do you think it is for Singaporeans, that transparency?
Yeah, I think it's extremely important because the budget, of course, represents the government's major agenda or program.
Right.
And so both in terms of the consultations that take place before the budget's formulated, getting the feedback not just from the business community, but also from different segments of society, and how that after the budget is rolled out too, the communication of the measures and what it means to people, all that is critically important. And I do agree with Andrew that it's quite comprehensive in terms of the different modes of engagement and delivery and communication, all the way from, of course, the print, broadcast media, to also the online space and the preparation of many budget collaterals, so to speak, which are flyers that are tailored to businesses, to households, to sort of distill the key essence of what the budget means to people. I think those are all part of the very important budget communication and engagement plan.
And just picking up on that, actually, I mean, I think one of the key things that have been interested in with this work is that it's not just once the budget comes out. That, for example, last night I was at a meeting with the National Youth Council and a consultation on the budget, and could see that the government invests in its consultations before the budget has come out to actually understand some of the key themes, some of the pressures that are coming through before that budget is released, and that there's an ongoing conversation across different cohorts of the population on it that says this isn't just about the product. This is a process, and it starts before we necessarily even see the budget.
When I was reading the report, one of the things that I did notice and that was highlighted in the report is the reform to how that pre-budget that you're talking about, those engagements, that communication, has changed over the years. And I'm old enough, having lived through many budgets as an adult, to have seen it, from the first budget I would have cared about as a young adult to today, how the government does engage different segments of the society, even the very young who are not voters. So there isn't that vested interest that you could accuse them of, because it is about information and education and communication. And that has changed and that has evolved. And I think it's absolutely wonderful. Could you give us a little bit more insight into what you found in that communication reform, how important it is, before I ask you maybe questions about what you'd like to see 20 years from now in the budget?
Well, we've talked just now about the sort of the annual process of that, and I think, though, that one of the real standout things in Singapore has been this Ford Singapore consultation, and to recognise that there's a periodic exercise as well as an annual one, and what impressed me with this in terms of how it fed in to the budget in your question was that 2022-23 process. Straight away in the 2023 budget, you could see initiatives that came from that exercise.
Right.
And followed up in 2024.
Followed up, that's the word that really excites me as a Singaporean. You can talk about it in Parliament. If nothing comes about from that conversation, it means nothing. But I feel that there is that follow-up, and that's wonderful.
It is, and it's not the first time it's happened. There was the Our Singapore conversation some years ago, and I understand there was one before that as well. In actual fact, that's an institution in its own right. That is a touch point on the social compact, and it's being used in a way that feeds into the budget, and that's supplementary on top of policy development, on top of consultations, whether it be business communities or the National Youth Council that I mentioned from last night. I mean, this provides a rich set of information to help inform budget decisions.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
I was just going to say that within the Forward Singapore conversation, there were many different modes of engagement as well. Some very large group gatherings, some sort of smaller, more intimate dialogue sessions. So I think they really help to reach out to different segments of society, basically.
One of the things that we look at is how this is being brought into the budget process. And you asked about other countries, and so we in this report there aren't recommendations. But we are looking at how things align, and whether it be gender perspectives brought into budgeting, is how well-being and outcomes being brought into budgeting. And so the mere fact that there is a very strong outcomes orientation here, whether it be skills future, whether it be healthy life years in terms of health outcomes, these things come through into the budget. So we've been looking at, we see that in OECD countries, and we have work within the OECD about how that's brought into the budgeting. And Singapore's showing that's part of the way it prepares its budget too.
So as a report card, how are we doing?
Well, there isn't a grade on this.
There should be.
But it does bring it together in a picture that shows that the credentials are there, they are of high quality. And look, every budget's going to have things to work on. And the mere fact that it is an annual event that says, this is what we did in the very recent past, how can we improve on it? Means that every government takes its budget and says, we need to just adapt it a little bit. Our economy's changed, our society's changed, sometimes our government has changed, sometimes our structure of the government is a new ministry, a new agency, we need to bring them in. How's the budget changed? And really keeping that in sync is its own challenge.
The thing with a budget, there is so much in it. You are looking across so many sectors and ministries. But since I come from communication, Then I want to just ask one more question of Terence. As a Singaporean, as an academic, do you think we could do more to communicate, particularly with our younger generation? Or we're doing such a great job, we'll just keep doing it that way? What do you think?
I think there's always room for improvement. I'm glad that Andrew really recently met up with the youth engagement through the National Youth Council. But I guess there are always going to be some young people who are more clued in or plugged into what's going on at the national level, and others who are maybe more apathetic, or maybe they have too many other things going on in their lives. And really, I think everybody should have a little bit of a baseline knowledge of what's going on. And so it's really for the ministry, which they're already doing, but I think even more can be done, to reach out and interest people in policies and budgets that affect their lives, so that they can be sort of informed citizens and contribute in that way. So whether it is finding new activities, new platforms where maybe it's not reaching out to exactly the same crowd, but different groups of people, to find some angle to hook their interest. I think that is going to be very important going forward.
Okay, all right. One last question for both of you, but we'll start with Andrew. This is the crystal ball question. If you were to write an updated report, and fast forward 20 years, I don't know why we always like to fast forward, but I suppose it helps with planning. 20 years from now, what would you like to see in Singapore's budget then?
Oh, firstly, I'd say don't wait 20 years. the OECD is very close, so and there's an excellent relationship between Singapore and the OECD, so there's no need to wait that long. We've also seen that Singapore's constantly reforming, transforming, that there's probably a lot to say in the period before then. The other is that look, it's actually quite a big accolade to acknowledge how much transformation that the government has put into its budget process, and so just keeping where it's at is going to take a lot of investment in itself. And this report, in a way, is signalling, and it does, that probably that change is going to need to continue in terms of changes to the economy, digital transformation, societal changes with an aging population. That says that's going to need to continue. I think the biggest risk would be to slow down. That actually this is a call for saying bank these changes and be ready for the fact that more transformation is going to be necessary through the budget process as it supports the economy generally. That's what we would like to see as a general message. But there are also several areas within the report where the government, the Ministry of Finance, has started on a path. It may be in terms of an increased level of reporting, which we've seen from some of the material that it's put out. There's a really strong message in here: keep going. And there's no time to waste with that. Keep going with it. The track shows that it aligns very well internationally, aligns with practices across OECD countries. You're in good company, and therefore continue with it.
Okay, Terence, I started by saying one of my key takeaways was fiscal sustainability.
Yes.
I asked him the crystal ball question. The connecting question would be, how do we maintain that fiscal sustainability, given the fact that obviously we're doing more for our society, for our vulnerable communities?
Yeah. So the needs
is
and
that going to be more challenging?
Yes, yeah, will always be growing, and not just with the aging population, but also the increased volatility in the world. There will be all kinds of shocks, economic and otherwise, that we need to respond to.
Militaries aren't cheap.
Yeah. So I think on the sustained basis, there's always this challenge: how to find the revenues for all that,
and
how to maybe even set aside more buffer to deal with contingencies. And of course, Singapore has a great advantage in having the national reserves. That's a great source of a resource that can be tapped on in times of need, and how we can sort of steward and build it up. But also on a recurring basis, the government is always needing to identify and strengthen different sources of revenue to be able to meet the needs. And I think that's going to be a huge priority. And within the budgeting system, it's also about how nimbly we can reallocate from one area to meet an emerging need. So I think the budget mechanisms are already moving in that direction, but we need to continue to evolve to give the government that sort of nimbleness in being able to channel resources to where the priorities and needs are greatest.
So how do we keep that financial, on a last note, that fiscal sustainability moving forward? 20 years from now?
It's an interesting question because there's a lot of judgment around what is fiscal sustainability.
Right.
And yet, against that backdrop, for all the conversation that might occur around what does that mean to me, what does that mean to you, and how is Singapore placed on it, is that there is, firstly, reserves. There is a reserve framework, and there's a very high bar about being able to tap into that, as you say, but it's not lightly and it's not frequently. But it's also not the only mechanism. And the fact that the government has, in addition to it, a budget, that meets many pressures too, that is actually a very active annual political mechanism that is there to support fiscal sustainability. It's just delivered in annual slices, knowing that there's the comfort of a sustainability and reserves framework that is in place sitting behind there. And there's actually several things in the middle too that we haven't touched on in this conversation that says there's quite a lot in the toolbox.
Food for thought then for future budgets. Andrew Blazey, Deputy Head of Budgeting and Public Management, OECD. Terence Ho, Associate Professor, Practice, SUSS. Thank you both for coming on and helping us to unpack this OECD report. Once again, Singapore's Budget 2025 will be delivered in Parliament on February 18th. Look out for our upcoming episode when we ask experts to make some educated guesses on just what might be in the budget this year. Until then, I'm Claressa Monteiro. This has been Lens on Singapore. Thank you for listening.